Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am again, of course, your host, Becky, and in today's episode, I thought I would start off with the topic of cybersex, or digital sex. And what I mean specifically is having sex online, whether it be with, strangers or people you know. This also includes things like sexting, or sexy Snapchats, or chat rooms, things of that nature. And the first thing I kind of want to say about this is that sex online, there's nothing wrong with it. But I will also say that with a warning, in terms that having sex online is great as long as you know that the person on the other side isn't going to use your image or use your, as long as you are aware that the person on the other side of the screen is going to respect you enough to either delete the pictures if things don't work out, or are going to be respectful in the sense of you don't want them to share the photos to people they know, put them online, things of that nature. So I will say having sex online, great. But also be aware that there are people out there who are not on that same page as you. Unless you're okay with some of your things ending up online, that's fine too. Own your truth. For me personally, I wouldn't want that. So I know that there are people who don't respect those wishes. So just be careful. And again, just make sure that you're being open and honest with that person before you're engaging in something that, could harm you in the long run. Or I would just recommend, as always, be open and honest, and just remember to be safe while you're exploring these avenues. So I actually found this really great article. It's by thedailymail.com, which I believe is a UK site. It has a .uk at the end. And they have this really great article that was published in 2014 that kind of goes over a percentage of people, what percentage of people were having digital sex or cyber sex. And one of the things that I found was interesting about this study was that, it was done in 2014. It's been 6 years since then. And the thing I'm interested to know is, what are those statistics now? Because in this study, it looks like it took a total of 1,612 men and women over the age of 18. And these people called themselves regularly sexually active. And what the study had found was that 34% of men and women admit to sending sexts or explicit photos on Snapchat or chat rooms, or using webcams and video phones to have cyber sex. They also found that 60% had taken part in online sex or had a sexual encounter with someone they weren't in a relationship with. Now, whether or not they were in a relationship and fooling around online isn't really specified. But I would say as long as your partner is okay with you doing that, go for it, but make sure you're honest about it. Otherwise, you're just kind of being rude. I said it. So the study kind of continues to go on and say that 37% of people said that the most popular version of sex, digital sex, was sexting, and video phone sex was 37%, and webcam sex was 26%, which I think kind of makes sense as sexting can be a little more accessible. whereas video phones and webcamming is something that you more than likely have to do at home rather than being able to do it on the go. That is the one thing about, cyber sex or digital sex, is that if you're doing things like Snapchats or text messaging, it's much easier to do on the go, right? I mean, you can send a text without necessarily engaging in some kind of mutual masturbation or some kind of sexual act with that person. Rather, you can kind of continually do this play of, well, I want to do X, Y, and Z to you. They want to do X, Y, Z to me, and kind of continue that play throughout the day. And then once you get home, that's when you can kind of break out the vibrator. You can break out the sex toys. If your partner is not there, or as the study is saying, you're having these encounters with people online who you don't necessarily know. But either way, I thought this was kind of an interesting way of breaking down, how we see cyber sex. The one tidbit of information that I had seen on this article that didn't really surprise me was that almost a fifth of people in long-distance relationships are using cyber sex to, kind of keep that sexual energy between the two of them. I feel like this is very common when you're in a long-distance relationship. I know I've been there. And it can be really helpful. And it definitely reminds you and your partner that there's still a kind of intimacy between you two. There's still something, there's still a spark between you two, even though you aren't in the same place. I have to say the most surprising thing about this is, granted, this is 2014, so again, 6 years ago. I think it's kind of grown since then, but it says that only 15% had explicit encounters on Snapchat, which I think is definitely higher now. I think Snapchat has become a way of being able to send pictures without necessarily worrying about, oh, well, someone's going to save them, they're going to use them later. It kind of eliminates that fear. Maybe not as much now, because you can kind of change the amount of time. Snapchat has really kind of cut back on the ability to kind of quickly erase those things. But I think it also does notify you if someone's taken a screenshot of something. So there's that. I definitely think that there's something to be said about cyber sex or digital sex in general. One, it's, kind of exciting, especially if you're doing it with someone who you don't necessarily know. There's kind of a stranger element to it. And I think we've talked about this before. There's something kind of thrilling about the mystery of someone who you don't necessarily know or don't necessarily have a relationship with yet. It's just sex. So there is something kind of anonymous about it. There's something slightly less pressure, I think, about sexting and digital sex, because you have a screen in between you. So it kind of makes it easier to, say things to your partner or say things to a potential partner that maybe you would be uncomfortable saying to their face or in an intimate setting. I've said on here, I don't even know, 50 to 100 times, being open and honest with your partner is so important in all aspects of your sexual relationships. But I know that can be hard. And sometimes being able to say it through a screen is so much easier, and so much easier to articulate, so much easier to have the courage to say. So I'm finding that this is becoming more and more apparent in today's society. And that's okay. I think if we work on destigmatizing sex and work on better sexual education and better understanding of what intimacy is, I don't think that this would be as much of a problem. But I can't even really say that it's a problem. It's more of just something that we need to be aware of as a society, as people. We need to understand that there are dangers when it comes to sharing personal photos of each other or personal videos of each other with, people we may or may not know, or even people that we do know who maybe it doesn't work out. So I think if we, again, destigmatize, have an open dialogue with each other of, what sex is, what should we be looking for, all of those things are going to make this less of a scary subject in general. And I think that's the overall message that we're kind of looking for. And on that note, I'm going to take a quick break, and when I come back, we're going to be talking a little bit about role-playing. Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I, again, of course, am your host, Becky, and in our first segment, we were talking a little bit about cyber sex, or digital sex, or sexting, and, that it can come with some dangers, but also everybody's doing it. We talked about a study done in 2014, and of course, those figures have probably spiked since then. And then in this segment, I wanted to kind of continue this idea of anonymity and talk a little bit about role-playing. Now, sexual role-playing, if you don't know, sexual role-playing is the idea of being with your partner and taking on different personas and bringing those personas into the bedroom in order to either spice up your sex life or play out some kind of fantasy you've been thinking, and making it a reality. And I think a lot of times role-playing is thought to be, something for people in more extreme fetishes. BDSM uses a lot of role-play. The whole kind of scenario ends up being a bit of a role play. You have a dominant and a submissive. But role play can also be something that you do for fun. I actually found another study done in 2015, done by Bustle, and they actually surveyed 5,000 men and women between the ages of 18 and 35 about what they were thinking in terms of sexual behaviors, role playing, and things like that. And according to this study, it seems like a lot of millennials are really interested in role-playing and are really interested in playing out some kind of character fantasy. The analogy that they use on here is they're into role-playing whether it's Halloween or not. As someone who wants it to be Halloween every single day, mood. Big mood. Definitely want to be a different character every day. One of the interesting things I found in this study is that it says that 17% of this study said that their favorite role-playing exercise was to play strangers. And the one example they had said was, if you're going on a trip with your partner, go on the plane as if you don't know each other, take a taxi home, or if you're in a hotel, meet at the hotel bar separately and pretend you don't know each other. This can become a multi-part fantasy, which I find really interesting. I'm definitely interested to try it. And it's getting to re-meet your partner all over again. And it may seem kind of silly, but it also can bring a lot of passion into an already established relationship. And what's interesting about this fact is that it says that 17% of millennial couples favor role-playing as strangers, but 20% of women who have surveyed prefer it above all other forms of role-play too. meaning that, which I think is interesting because, I mean, one, I'm interested to try out this scenario. It's something that I haven't done. And two, I think it's also, this fact brings some attention of like, women also are interested in sex. Society has kind of dictated that women should not be sexual creatures. And so I liked that they inserted this fact of 20% of women, because it also brings to the attention that role-playing can be something that women like to do. And it doesn't have to necessarily be, Catholic schoolgirl or stripper or, some kind of slutty XYZ. It can just be, I want to meet you again, and I want to have that moment of having sex with you for the first time again. And I mean, there's kind of something romantic about that, isn't there? However, that being said, 18% of men, it seems, prefer their partner to do the schoolgirl thing during role playing. There's also 13% of millennials are interested in their partner dressing like a stripper. And then there's also 12% of millennials who found inspiration in pretending to be Anastasia and Christian Grey from 50 Shades of Grey. If you haven't listened to my BDSM podcast, you know how I feel about 50 Shades of Grey. But I understand there's a lot of passion between them. There's a lot of hot situations that you can kind of draw from them. But if you're going to role play as the characters from 50 Shades of Grey, please do your research. Please don't go into BDSM blindly or thinking anyone can do it. There's a lot of learning that goes into BDSM on a whole. So please just keep that in mind. But overall, I think it's interesting. And I think that role-playing is something that we don't necessarily think of as often, other than early mainstream media sexual scenes. Maybe this is just me, but I normally don't think of role-play as something to do in the bedroom necessarily. But the whole strangers scenario is definitely something that I am very much interested in. And on that note, I'm going to take another quick break, and when I come back, we're going to be talking about period sex. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I again am your host, Becky, and in our first segment, we talked a little bit about cyber sex. We talked about the dangers and the kind of fun that you can have with it. In our second segment, we talked about role play and, again, some statistics on role play and, who likes what and different scenarios you can try, what's popular. And in this segment, I wanted to talk about period sex. One, I don't think period sex is ever really talked about. It's never in mainstream media unless it's in a joke or to shame women in some way. And And one, I think we should stop that just in general, because women with vaginas get their period. It's just something that happens. And I think we should stop either shaming women or making it a joke. And I think society has come a long way in doing that. However, in talking with my friends recently, the topic of period sex had come up. And I'll be honest with you, it's not something that I think of often either. And it's not something that I personally have been overly comfortable with any of my partners. So the idea of period sex was something that I was interested in, learning more about, because the topic came up and I was like, I don't really know anything about that. So here I am to tell you a little bit about it. First of all, I will preface this by saying this episode, or this segment of this episode, is really kind of pointed towards people with vaginas. And for the purpose of this specific segment, since I'm talking about vaginas and that biology, I'm going to be using the term women, just to make it easier on me. I understand that some women don't have vaginas, and, that's amazing, and go for you, good for you. I can't speak. And I'm, granted, I'm still learning, but for the purpose of this episode, I would like to use the word woman, specifically talking about people with vaginas. So the first thing that I learned in this is that period sex can actually help with cramps. If I had known this, I would have done it a long time ago. I'm lucky enough that my cramps aren't crippling to my day or, overly awful. But I know a lot of women who do have really terrible cramps, and boy, I was really excited to tell them about this. And so the reason this is because when you're having your period, it's your uterus contracting in order to release the lining and basically shed its skin, quote unquote, shed its lining, in order to clean itself. So basically when you're having a cramp, it's your uterus contracting in order to do that. Guess when else your uterus contracts? When you have an orgasm. So it actually helps your uterus with what it's already doing. Plus, on top of it, sex also triggers the release of endorphins in your brain, which makes you feel good and will help your body lessen the discomfort and occupy your mind against having it feel bad. You know what else that means? It means that your periods are shorter. Yeah. It means because you're helping the uterus push out that lining faster, it means that your periods could become shorter, because your uterus has to do less work. And once the work is done, you're done. So all those things for me are definite positives, and were things that, I wish had been taught in health class when I was going to high school. Because one, it's good to know, and two, I just wish I had known. That's kind of the bottom line. Not that it necessarily would have, spurred me on to have more sex at a younger age. But it's definitely an interesting thing to know about my body of, because that means you could have an orgasm, with your vibrator and still have the same effect. So the fact that, we didn't know until, or at least I didn't know until now, kind of a disservice. Public school system, thanks. So all of those things being said, there are also risks of pregnancy if you are in a heterosexual relationship. While your chances of getting pregnant are lower, there is always still a chance that if you are having unprotected sex, there's always a chance that you could become pregnant. So using a condom definitely a good idea. Especially if you are worried, if it's a new relationship or if you're just generally worried about both of your health. This also increases the risk of STI and HIV. So just be cautious of that as well. But all that being said, having sex on your period, not a big deal. Honestly, it's not something that you necessarily want to talk to about your partner, I would say. I know for me, it was kind of a difficult conversation that I just had recently, but it is something that you can definitely use in the future. And if you are going to have period sex, here are some tips as to how to do it. If you plan to have sex in a bed or somewhere else in your living quarters, the one tip that this article that I am reading from Healthline says that, spread a dark covered towel on the bed to catch any blood leaks. Or if you're comfortable, have sex in the shower or the bath, because this will avoid any blood going on your furniture. Blood is definitely hard to get out. So those are some definite options. It also recommends that you keep a wet washcloth or wet wipes by the bed to clean up afterwards. And also to have your partner wear a latex condom, which will help prevent pregnancy and STIs, as I had said. And then the last tip that they had said on here is if your usual sexual position is uncomfortable, try something different. For example, you may want to try laying on your side with your partner behind you. And so, just like in our last episode, we talked a little bit about positions. So maybe switch it up. I mean, you're already having period sex. Maybe that's new for you. Switch up the position too. See what happens. So basically, my final thoughts on this are interested in trying something new. And also extremely excited because just spreading the information, I think, is really important. As I've said on here before, always be open and honest, having conversations with your partner. They may not be grossed out. I know the general consensus around periods is that they're gross or you don't necessarily want to deal with them. So having the conversation out in the open of like, this could be good for me because my period will be done faster. This might be good for you. Blood apparently is a good lubricant. That's what this article says. So all things to think about. Sex in the shower might be new. Different positions might be new. But overall, I think the general thought for me was more people need to know about this and more people need to be educated about this. And on that note, that's all I have for you today. As always, thank you for listening. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. A good review always helps us out. You can let me know how I'm doing. You can let me know how we are doing. And you can also check us out on social media. Our social media Facebook page is Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, or you can look us up on Twitter at GSMC_sex. I, of course, am your host, Becky, as always. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you learned something. Don't forget to always be open and honest with your partner, and I will see you all next time. Bye!
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.